SpaceX is planning to launch Starship from the sea. Again. You see, Starship is the most powerful rocket ever launched, but firing something this powerful right on land where people live comes with some pretty serious downsides and strict regulations. So, SpaceX's solution is to take the launch pad out to sea. But how exactly is that going to work? And will it really be better than the launch platforms they already have on land? A Starship sea launch platform will be very different, and here's why. Okay, so this is a formal letter that SpaceX recently sent to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, responding to the agency's request for information about using the U.S. outer continental shelf for space operations. SpaceX is basically saying, hey, what if we use the ocean for Starship operations? The company is interested in using offshore facilities for things like launching Starship, catching returning Starships, and potentially supporting other reusable spacecraft operations in the future. But there's an important detail here. SpaceX isn't asking to build a giant floating Starbase for them, and it isn't asking the agency to simply approve a Starship launch. Instead, SpaceX wants BOEM to establish that existing offshore leasing laws can legally be used to host spaceflight infrastructure. In other words, the company is looking at infrastructure that already exists and asking whether some of it could be repurposed for spaceflight. And that could theoretically include something pretty familiar: an old oil platform being transformed into a launch and catch facility for Starship. SpaceX points to its experience recovering Falcon boosters and Starship's role as NASA's Artemis lunar lander to make the case that offshore infrastructure could eventually help make spaceflight as routine and reusable as aviation. They also want you to subscribe to the channel right now. Okay, SpaceX doesn't actually say that, but you should do it anyway so you don't miss any cool updates like this. Anyway, if you're a longtime SpaceX follower like I am, you probably know this isn't the first time the company has wanted to catch Starship from the sea. But somehow, that doesn't make this new development any less surprising. If anything, it makes it even more interesting. To understand why those offshore platforms are coming back into the picture, though, we need to go back and understand why SpaceX abandoned the idea in the first place. SpaceX bought 2 offshore oil rigs in 2020, later renaming them Phobos and Deimos, for about $3.5 million each. The plan was to strip away all the old drilling equipment and turn these giant floating structures into mobile launch and landing platforms for Starship. And, for a while, SpaceX actually started doing it. Some of the old equipment was removed, especially from Phobos. But then the work slowed down dramatically, and eventually the rigs sat mostly idle for about a year. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. Turning an old oil rig into a Starship launch site isn't exactly a weekend DIY project. SpaceX would have needed massive launch towers, propellant tanks, miles of plumbing, ground support equipment, and pretty much an entire launch complex sitting on top of something that is floating in the ocean. The land-based Starship launch infrastructure was already proving incredibly difficult. The first full-stack launch showed just how much punishment Super Heavy's engines could throw at the launch site. Now, imagine trying to deal with all of that on a floating platform, where the ocean gets to join the engineering meeting. At the time, Gwynne Shotwell essentially made the point that SpaceX needed to focus on actually flying Starship and learning how the vehicle behaved before committing to something as ambitious as an offshore launch system. And that made sense. But now, could this finally be the right time to bring the idea back? Well, SpaceX has come a very long way since those early days. On Flight 13, the latest test of the third-generation Super Heavy Starship system, SpaceX achieved its most successful flight to date. For the first time in the program's history, the 52-meter upper stage survived atmospheric re-entry, completed its landing flip, and made a controlled splashdown in the Indian Ocean. It also deployed 20 operational Starlink V3 satellites during the flight and successfully performed an in-space Raptor restart. And then there's the heat shield. After years of struggling with Starship's notoriously difficult re-entry protection, Elon Musk said SpaceX now considers the heat shield problem solved. Even the launch pad came out looking surprisingly good. Flight 13 is now paving the way for Flight 14 to make the first true orbital attempt. And if SpaceX can stabilize orbital flights, Starship could quickly move toward routine operational missions, including launching SpaceX's massive Starlink V3 constellation. So, if SpaceX wants to take the next big step and bring those offshore Starship platforms back into the plan, they might now have enough confidence to do it. Okay, it's cool that SpaceX might want to bring the offshore idea back, but there's still a pretty obvious question. How exactly do you turn an old oil rig into a Starship launch and landing platform? Now, nothing in SpaceX's letter specifically names those two old rigs, Phobos and Deimos, so we can't say they're definitely coming back. But the strategy SpaceX originally designed them for is now, at least in principle, being discussed in an official federal document. And, well, we've got to start somewhere. So let's assume SpaceX buys or repurposes something similar. The first step would be getting rid of a lot of the stuff that was designed for drilling oil in the first place. That means stripping away drilling equipment, pipes, machinery, and other infrastructure that Starship really doesn't care about. Removing this equipment is already a normal part of decommissioning an offshore oil rig, although normal and cheap are definitely not the same thing when we're talking about a giant floating industrial complex. Once the rig is cleared out, SpaceX could start building the infrastructure Starship actually needs. The biggest change would probably be creating a large, open area that could serve as a landing pad. Then you'd need a huge tank farm for storing the propellants, all the plumbing and ground support systems to move those propellants around, and, of course, some kind of massive lifting system capable of handling Starship. Basically, you'd need something that can do the job of Mechazilla. Now, right in the middle is the giant tower known as the derrick. It was originally designed to support all the heavy equipment needed for drilling. So at first glance, you might think, perfect, just bolt a giant Starship crane onto it and call it a day. Unfortunately, the ocean has apparently decided to make things complicated again. Directly underneath the derrick is something called the moon pool, a large opening in the rig that allowed drilling equipment to pass through the platform and into the ocean. But that giant hole could actually become extremely useful for Starship. Remember, during launch, Super Heavy's engines are going to produce an absolutely ridiculous amount of thrust. SpaceX needs somewhere for all that energy and exhaust to go without turning the launch platform into an extremely expensive pile of scrap metal. One possibility is to use the moon pool as part of the launch system. The launch mount could be built directly above the opening, allowing the rocket's engines to fire downward through the rig and into the ocean below. The water could then help absorb and redirect some of that enormous energy, potentially reducing the amount of punishment transferred into the platform itself. So, instead of completely redesigning the rig from scratch, SpaceX could potentially take some of the structures that were already there, remove what it doesn't need, and build Starship infrastructure around them. Of course, making that actually work is a massive engineering challenge. But if SpaceX can pull it off, launching from the ocean could unlock some pretty major advantages that you simply can't get from a traditional land-based launch site. First, there's the noise. Imagine a more than 120-meter-tall rocket lighting up its engines and climbing into the sky. 33 powerful engines are firing at once, producing a sound so ridiculously loud that even several kilometers away, the noise can reach potentially dangerous levels. Now move that entire operation out into the middle of the ocean. Instead of having nearby towns and communities listening to what sounds like the world's angriest lawnmower, the closest people might be a support crew on a ship several kilometers away, and even they would mostly hear a distant rumble. But reducing noise is only one advantage. The much bigger benefit is safety. When rockets launch from land, especially from inland spaceports, there's always the risk that something comes back down where you really don't want it to. With traditional expendable rockets, the lower stage is discarded after burnout and eventually falls back to Earth. This has been a particularly serious issue in parts of China, where some rockets launch from inland facilities, and their discarded stages have occasionally landed near populated areas. And even with a reusable rocket like Starship, things can still go very wrong. If a vehicle suffers a catastrophic failure during flight, you really don't want pieces of a giant rocket raining down over someone's house. Out at sea, you have a much bigger safety buffer. If something goes wrong, the goal is for the debris to come down in the ocean instead of someone's backyard. Because of that, an offshore launch facility could eventually offer SpaceX a different regulatory environment than a conventional launch site on land, potentially reducing some of the logistical and bureaucratic headaches involved in operating a major rocket facility. And there's another advantage that's a little less obvious: where you can launch. From a traditional launch site, rockets are heavily restricted from flying over populated areas, so they generally have to head toward the ocean as quickly as possible. That can limit which orbital trajectories are practical. For example, missions to geostationary orbit benefit from launching close to the equator and traveling eastward, taking advantage of Earth's rotation. And Earth is moving fast. We don't feel it because, well, we're all moving together. But at the equator, the surface is traveling at roughly 1,674 kilometers per hour as the planet completes one rotation every day. That natural speed gives an eastward-launched rocket a useful boost. The problem is that most launch sites aren't sitting directly on the equator, so rockets have to deal with geographic and trajectory constraints that can cost performance. A mobile offshore platform changes the equation. Instead of building the launch site wherever there happens to be suitable land, you can potentially move the launch platform to wherever the mission needs it. Want to launch closer to the equator? Move the platform. Need a particular orbital inclination? Position it accordingly. Suddenly, the launch site itself becomes mobile, and every bit of performance saved by avoiding unnecessary trajectory changes can potentially be used to carry more payload into space. So, better safety, less noise, more flexibility in choosing orbital trajectories, and potentially greater payload capacity are already some pretty compelling reasons to launch from the ocean. All of this makes turning an oil rig into a Starship launch and catch platform sound like a pretty great idea. But could it actually be so good that SpaceX eventually replaces its land-based launch sites entirely? Unfortunately, probably not. For one thing, just getting the rocket out there is a massive logistical headache. Transporting a 120-meter-tall Starship and its super-heavy booster to an offshore platform is not exactly like taking a Falcon 9 out for a little boat ride. And even Falcon 9 has had some rather uncomfortable experiences at sea, including cases where boosters tipped over during transport. Starship is obviously in a completely different league. Then you have to figure out how to actually operate the thing once it gets there. Cryogenic propellant loading at sea, transferring crew, maintaining the vehicle, supplying electricity, handling spare parts, dealing with communications, and waiting for suitable weather conditions would all add layers of complexity and cost. And, of course, the rocket still needs fuel. Huge quantities of liquid methane and liquid oxygen would have to be transported out to the platform and stored in specialized cryogenic tanks. That means SpaceX would need to build a serious offshore propellant storage system, along with all the plumbing and equipment needed to safely transfer those liquids into the rocket. And then there's the launch itself. When Starship fires its engines, it's going to throw an absolutely ridiculous amount of energy downward. If the exhaust is allowed to hit the ocean directly, you could end up with a massive cloud of hot exhaust, steam, and seawater spraying all over the platform, which sounds great for absolutely nobody who has to clean it afterward. You could install a flame diverter, similar to the systems used at traditional launch pads, to redirect the exhaust away from the platform. The thing is, on a floating structure, redirecting that enormous exhaust flow could potentially create sideways forces on the platform. And you probably don't want your launch pad deciding to drift sideways at exactly the moment your 120-meter rocket is trying to leave it. So yes, there are a lot of problems to solve. None of these challenges necessarily require some revolutionary scientific breakthrough. They're mostly engineering, logistics, infrastructure, and cost problems. And that's why I don't think offshore platforms are going to replace land-based Starship launch sites anytime soon. In fact, SpaceX probably needs both. Land-based infrastructure, with systems like Mechazilla, is the practical, near-term solution. It has already enabled booster catches, rapid turnaround, and the development of the ground system SpaceX needs to make Starship reusable. Offshore platforms, meanwhile, could become the long-term solution for things land-based sites simply can't do as easily. Isolating launches from populated areas, reducing noise, giving SpaceX much more freedom over orbital trajectories, and potentially enabling extremely high launch cadence, or even point-to-point transportation between distant locations. So the ocean probably isn't going to replace Starbase. Instead, it could become another piece of the puzzle. And if SpaceX can make both systems work together, the company wouldn't just have launch sites on land. It would have something its competitors don't have quite as easily: a launch site you can move.